Well, good evening and welcome to Coalition for Conservation's webinar on the electrification of transport and fuel security. In the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community, paying my respect to their elders, present and past. I'm Cristina Talaco, the chair of C4C, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are a not-for-profit advocating for a faster transition to a carbon-neutral economy, providing a forum for discussions where we bring together government, business, and experts. Now, this is our third event on EVs, and the reason for our persistent focus on this topic is because transport is such a crucial part of the pathway to achieve net zero. And it's also one of our greatest challenges. So tonight's discussions will explore such challenges, including charging infrastructure, batteries, how to speed the rolling out of EVs, and what would be the best framework from a policy point of view. We will also cover fuel security and the private sector movement as we come closer and closer to experiencing this inevitable transport revolution. Now, in terms of format, I'll ask some questions first to the panelists, and then I will open to the audience. So please type your questions in the Q&A box. Make sure that they're relevant to the topic, and the webinar will be recorded. So the recording will be circulated to everyone who registered. Now, we have an outstanding panel of experts joining us this evening from government, business, and industry. We're waiting for Dr. Katie Allen to join. She's a little bit late tonight. She's the member for Higgins. But we've got here Trent Zimmerman, the member for North Sydney, Behiad Jafari, the CEO of the Electric Vehicle Council, and also Luke Todd, the managing director of NextPort. And in the interest of time, I will not be reading their bios tonight. So let me start by welcoming our MP Trent. Trent, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us. Could you maybe share with us your insights on the electrification of transport from a government perspective and its role in the net zero transition?
Well, thanks, Chris. And firstly, thanks for having us. And more importantly, thank you for all that you're doing. You have the most impressive lineup of speakers, former British Prime Ministers, Lords, Ministers, and obviously the B team tonight with me. But thankfully, Behiad and Luke are here to fill the gap. But look, it is a critical area for our transition to a net zero economy because, as most people would know, transport emissions account for about 20% of Australia's overall emissions. And I think perhaps understandably, but to the exclusion at times of other areas of the economy, a lot of our focus has been on getting the energy sector right. And I think that it's absolutely vital that when we're doing that, that we're not forgetting those other sectors of emissions in the economy that are also generating a large slab of our overall emissions. I think that it's absolutely crucial that government is supporting the transition to electric and other zero emission fuels, and obviously hydrogen potentially down the track will play a role in this regard. I suspect primarily with heavy vehicles, but we just don't know yet in some ways, because you can't get to net zero without doing that. And from my perspective, there is a lot of activity happening at both the state and federal level and in some local governments as well. Each state is on a different pathway. Some are doing better than others. And at the federal level, we saw earlier this year the release of a discussion paper on low emissions fuels. Overall, what I'd say is that I think that we've reached the time where there's obviously growing consensus about reaching net zero by 2050, that really the policy framework needs to work backwards from there in all sectors, and that includes transport. So we effectively need to be looking at a timeline that actually delivers us that net zero outcome by 2050. And that therefore guides what governments are doing in trying to encourage Australians to adopt electric vehicles. So without wanting to wrap it on for too long, it means, for example, that you probably need to be looking at earlier targets for reaching net zero emissions for bus fleets because they have a longer operational life than passenger vehicles. But it does mean that you've got to take into account things like the fact that most cars in Australia have a 10-year life. So from my perspective, that means that if you haven't really reached universal coverage in terms of new car sales with net zero emissions by the mid-30s, late 30s, then you're going to struggle to meet the 2050 deadline. So that's why, from my own perspective, I think that governments should be adopting the target, including the federal government, of effectively reaching the goal of 100% net zero vehicles, electric vehicles primarily, by the mid-2030s. And I might leave it at that so I don't keep rabbiting on.
Thank you. Sounds like a very sound strategy. Let's see what our industry expert here has to say. Behiad is the CEO of the EV Council. He works with industry, government, and the media to accelerate electrification of road transport. This is the third time he's joining us. Behiad, welcome again. What do you see from your point of view? What are the most crucial missing links to the acceleration of EVs in Australia? And how would the net zero target, as Trent mentioned, would help?
Thanks, Christina. And if I can add my thanks to both your work and the Coalition's work, it is the third time I've had the benefit of joining you guys, and looking forward to having many, many more of these, celebrating the various successes of electric vehicles. A very good question of what is missing here. And so let's be a bit clear on where we are. So today we have some 0.7% of the vehicles sold in our market being electric. We can all imagine scenarios for certain people for whom electric vehicles aren't suitable today. But really, we're looking at an environment where, whether in California, the United Kingdom, the EU, something like 10% of all the new vehicles that they are selling today are electric vehicles, and their markets look very different to ours. They have very many more lower price electric vehicles made available in their market. So this isn't 10% of people buying luxury vehicles or Teslas and the like. This is more cheaper things like Volkswagen vehicles, Nissans, Hyundais being made available to them. And the reality for us is that while the market and the industry has gone quite some way globally, there is a global competition for investment in electric vehicles, whether that's bringing vehicles to a market, rolling out charging infrastructure, going on to provide services like ride sharing and ride hailing, car sharing services with electric vehicles. What often happens is there is a global scan of where different markets are up to and what's available there. In most of the world, particularly across the developed world, what companies and investors can see is that there are things like regulations that require the sale of electric vehicles in most of these markets. There are very generous consumer incentives around the range of $10,000 Australian for the purchase of an electric vehicle. So as you can appreciate, a company with particularly a cheaper electric vehicle or other products is much more attracted to those other markets. I'm a CEO of a body that represents investors in industry who wants to invest in the electric vehicle sector here in Australia. And by far that, they see that consumers are ready and have the appetite for electric vehicles in Australia. The industry does want to move, but they are looking for those similar signals that provide them with the certainty to say, come and start bringing product here and the market will come. And that is something that is led by the type of things that Trent talked about, of the government helping accelerate the shifts towards zero emissions vehicles.
Thank you. Todd, you're an expert in the manufacturing of electric buses, as managing director of Nexport, which is the largest electric bus supplier. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're the largest in Australia. You have over 50 zero emissions buses procured through the New South Wales government bus panel right now. What do you see the efficiency of Australia's public transport system improving with EVs, and what will it take to electrify the entire public transport fleet in Australia?
Well, first of all, thank you, Chris, and thank you for everyone that's joining this evening. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you. To answer the question, I think the benefits of in the public transport sector specifically are numerous. When I first personally started on the journey of transitioning vehicles from diesel buses to electric buses, I formerly had a relatively large operational business. Initially, the driver was to see how we could improve the environment, and it was sort of a commercially driven opportunity that if we had cleaner fleets, we would potentially secure more business. Over time, what I've come to realize is that, yes, public transport and transitioning to electric buses has a wonderful outcome when we're looking at a broader challenge to the globe with climate change and so on. But what I'm focused on daily and what I'm seeing daily is the impact that we can have in communities and the quality of air that we can improve. So every electric bus or zero emission bus that we put into a community, it's actually making real benefit for people that are in that community. So whilst in the early days it was a very different story, and when early days, I'm sort of talking 7 or 8 years ago when we first started to look at electric vehicles. Now I see our focus very much in the public transport sector being about how we can improve communities, how we can improve the quality of air, but also other benefits such as noise pollution. That's something that gets very underrated in this conversation. If anybody sat or stands next to a bus, diesel bus near a bus interchange or at a bus stop, next time, please take a moment, pause and actually listen to the bus, look at the fumes that come out of that vehicle. It's quite considerable. And when you look at every vehicle that we can replace with electric, every time we do that, we're removing those harmful gases from communities. And there's numerous studies that we could talk for hours about on the benefits of that for the community. That also flows into things like timetabling. So, for example, certain routes where you may not be able to access a certain suburb because the buses are too noisy. With electric buses, because they're silent, we can now have a much more fluid operation, which enables operators to run better quality services, more direct services, getting people far more public transport system. So the benefits are considerable, and I really think we're just at the tipping point of seeing mass adaptation of electric buses across Australia.
That's very true. People do tend to think more about the air quality, but there's also the noise and other considerations. There's also the issue of fuel security for Australia, which it's something that we have to start thinking about. So maybe a question for Trent on that topic of fuel security, Trent. By 2030, there's going to be a ban on the sale of gasoline cars in the UK, for example. By 2035, they're saying all their cars and vans are going to be fully zero emission. They're investing $2.5 billion in that upgrade of their going to zero emission vehicles. And what's going to happen in terms of petrol cars? Is Australia going to become a dumping ground for old petrol cars? How are we going to be placed if we don't start moving as fast as other countries, including the US now with the Biden administration?
I think it's a really important question, and we've got to ensure that we're not that dumping ground. But on the issue of fuel security, I think it's actually one of the under-recognised arguments in relation to moving to electric vehicles. There's a fair amount of focus within the community and government on the moment, for example, in relation to our secure oil reserves in the event of a crisis. That problem almost goes away, at least when it comes to vehicles, if you've got the deployment of electric vehicles, because your fuel resource is able to be provided by fuel sources that we have in abundance, namely solar and wind particularly. So there is a strong, I think, fuel security argument for a move to electric vehicles. The other half of that, though, of course, is that it's not just the fuel source which is important. It's having the capacity to service and provide the technical requirements of electric vehicles. And I do think there's enormous potential for us to be developing great competency in areas like battery production. And this was one of the things the PM highlighted in the modern manufacturing plan. But when we're a country blessed with critical minerals, including lithium, why not better utilise them here to make sure that we have that additional security? And actually, one of the interesting things the last 12 months, which is interrelated, which maybe not something that Australia can immediately develop a capacity in, but we tend to focus on things like oil because it's something that we understand. We fill our cars with it every day of the week, well, not every day of the week, but frequently. But the last 12 months have shown, I think, broader security issues, and semiconductors comes particularly to mind, where we've seen effectively constraints on semiconductor production. And it's highlighted the fact that a large amount of world semiconductor production comes from Taiwan and South Korea, in a part of the world which is a little bit dicey at times. So there are issues like that I think Australia needs to pursue as well. But I think that's why, back to your original question about ensuring that we're not the dumping ground, that's why I strongly believe it has to be a priority for governments to make sure that we have a target in place to provide the certainty for car manufacturers to drive the uptake. Now, it's not just governments, it's consumers as well, but governments can help shape consumer decisions at basic level by providing them with information, but also overcoming those areas which the Electric Vehicle Council's highlighted so well in terms of why there is a hesitation about electric vehicles. So things like price, particularly in the short and medium term, the charging network, and also providing some assurance in relation to range. Australians like to think that we are frequent country travellers that involve long trips of thousands of kilometres. The reality is that most of us don't do that regularly, but nonetheless, it is one of those psychological things which impacts on our views about electric vehicles.
Certainly, I mean, there are potential flashpoints, as you mentioned, in the Middle East and South China Sea, and fuel security is going to become a stronger issue for us. There's also the issue with UK and Japan banning petrol cars, and they're the main RHD market, you know, the right-hand drive cars. And so in that case, who will be making the cars, Behyad or Luke, if we don't have those two markets anymore with the right-hand drive cars? Who would be making petrol cars that we can drive here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think important to remember that petrol and diesel, or internal combustion engine vehicles, as we call them, are already being manufactured. So in some ways, governments like the UK and Japan setting targets that ban the sale of those vehicles means that there are factories building petrol and diesel vehicles. And this is the concern around what we call the dumping ground effect of the people building them will say, either we have to shut down these factories or we have to try to find different markets that we can throw them to. And that becomes a concern as all of the new research and development funding goes into building cheaper and better electric vehicles. As there were great markets like Australia where we can send the older technology to for as long as possible before we finally shut them down and eventually move the market over to electric. I think it's really important. We're talking about, there is certainty that the future is electric. The question is, how long will Australia be a laggard? And that part is really up to us. I always like to say that our agenda is less about electric vehicles, it's more about Australia, because electric vehicles are taking the world by storm. It's Australia that's missing out on the opportunities that they present.
So Trent mentioned manufacturing. I was going to go to Luke to talk about that.
I might just jump in on some comments there in regards to electric vehicles. So within our group, Nexport, we're a multimodal electric vehicle company. So whilst we're leading the pack with electric buses, we also have a very strong relationship with BYD, one of the largest electric vehicle manufacturers in the world. And if you follow Nexport, or any of the people on today's session follow, we are actually making some relatively large announcements at the moment about bringing affordable electric vehicles to Australia. This year, we'll release 2 models that are going to, what we believe, be the tipping point for transition from internal combustion engine decision making across to electric vehicles. So what that means is electric vehicles that are high quality, but they will be at price parity to internal combustion engine. So yes, we are, as a country, a laggard. If we wish to use that word, we're less than 1% of vehicle sales are electric, but companies like mine and some others are actually taking that challenge on head first and working with really strong partners globally to deliver electric vehicles that will actually change the dynamic of the market. And we think by leading, that will then bring more competition. So when we introduce vehicles soon, and the first will be going on sale around mid-year 2021 this year, we think that will actually stimulate other manufacturers. So when I hear the likes of the Nissan chief sort of blasting the government for not having incentives, I take a different view of that. I don't disrespect that view, but equally I feel it's up to us as a market and as an economy and to actually just take that on. If the product that we're delivering to customers needs a subsidy for it to be attractive, in my view, that's a failure of the product. So what our company will do is deliver products that will be attractive to buy and they'll be at the right price point. So I support anything the government can do to assist us, but equally it's the market that needs to drive this and drive this change, and it's up to us to as market leaders to influence the take up of electric vehicles by introducing better quality electric vehicles at the right price.
So you're saying rather than incentives more related to buying the electric vehicles, maybe government should be looking at putting the right infrastructure so that promotes the sale. Trent, what is government doing in that sense in terms of charging infrastructure?
Well, there's a couple of things on that. So firstly, ARENA, the federal government's renewable energy agency, has been funding some pretty important projects, including fast charging networks, and the CEFC, I think, has been investing in that as well, and the states are doing that, and it's been in partnership with both the private sector, but also organisations like in my own state, like the NRMA. And motorist organisations have been very proactive in that regard. I think there are a number of challenges about that. I think that it is a key role that government can play supporting that charging network, particularly in the public domain and particularly along freeways. And I think ARENA's doing some work at the moment to identify major black spots. But I think the other flip side of that is the challenge of the fact that most people are going to want to charge their vehicle either at home or in their workplace. And there are two elements to that. It's how you encourage people, particularly those living in multi-dwelling homes like apartments and townhouses, how you retrofit those, but also just as importantly and more easily solvable in some ways is ensuring that new builds, new apartments and the like, new houses are EV ready. And in fact, in 2008, when I was a North Sydney councillor, I was pushing for us to amend our planning code to require buildings to be EV ready back then. But and there is some work being done on that, but I think the urgency of doing that is overwhelming. So there are national construction standards, very slow to change. There's nothing, I don't think, stopping state governments through their planning systems and even local councils, as some are doing, requiring new builds to be EV ready now, so that barrier, people being able to charge at home or in their workplaces, is overcome. But I also think there's a case for government support to do that. So I think that there is the opportunity for governments to look at whether there are financial support, either through the tax system or through direct grants, to assist homeowners and commercial properties to provide that type of support. I do think we need to settle the technology because obviously you don't want to go through that type of exercise and find that there's actually a better way. And particularly with some of the exciting work that's being done to allow effectively the two-way flow of energy from electric vehicles. So electric vehicles can actually operate as batteries on wheels and support the grid. We've got to make sure that we're getting the technology right in that regard. But the other thing I would say is that one of the focuses of the Future Fuels paper released by Angus Taylor was to particularly support commercial businesses with their fleets, which account for 40% of vehicles purchased at the moment. So that's another important side of it as well.
Well, Trent, on the Q&A, people are asking you for a comment on the tabled road user charges on EVs. Shouldn't we be incentivizing their uptake?
Absolutely, and I've spoken, and I'm pleased that the federal government has indicated it's not going down this path, but at the state level, it's just counterintuitive that states like Victoria and South Australia, and even potentially my own, would be considering that. I mean, I think when the market is mature, we will have to have a debate about the tax arrangements for vehicles, because obviously at the moment, a significant source of revenue for governments is the fuel excise. Now, obviously, you're not selling fuel because we've been so successful in supporting the uptake of EVs, and that's a significant source of funding, which supports road maintenance, for example, that disappears. But you have that discussion when the market's more mature. You don't effectively cripple the development of the EV market by imposing those state charges. And in fact, I think we've really got to head in the other direction. Some states and territories are already doing this, offering discounts for registration. I actually think we can go a lot further. And so, for example, I think that states should be looking at whether they offer for a finite period, 5 years or something like that, discounts on toll roads, and including new toll roads, and encouraging the EV market by providing those financial inducements or incentives, I think would be the better path to go down.
Would you like to comment, Bayard?
Yeah, look, Trent really hit it on the head there. It's discussion about moving towards a road user charging system is a sensible one, for something that transport policy experts have been talking about, as Trent would know from his previous life, for well over a decade. That's not what this is, though, right? This is a sort of early, what would say, premature and exclusive tax on electric vehicles when they make up 0.1% of the vehicles on our roads, 0.7% of vehicles being sold. That's way behind the rest of the world. What I said earlier is, can appreciate for those OEMs looking around the world and saying, we've got a $10,000 incentive in one market and none in another. That makes, that stacks some chips against us, to now become the world's first market to actually tax electric vehicles and to discourage people from buying them. Sends a very clear, don't invest here message. So really for states, this is what is the right order of doing these things? As with the road user charge discussion around the world, these next 5 years, this early part of the decade, accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles, because you need to get from where we are today to all of them being electric within the next decade. And then when they are more mature, when they've achieved a level of, we've said, 10% of our fleet, 20% of our fleet, then start looking at how to adjust taxes to clip the ticket and gain some tax revenue as well.
Yeah, I think we should, that's an idea, Trent. You seem to know a lot about EVs and your ideas are quite positive. Is there anything at government level, like a task force on electric vehicles? The UK has set up a very interesting thing called the Electric Vehicle Trading Scheme and Road Usage Duty Consultation Bill. They have an Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force, which comprises of key stakeholders in the energy infrastructure, automotive sector, and the government. I mean, what do we have at government level in that sense?
Well, Bayard would probably know that better than me, because it is a bit divided between state and federal, and so each state has its own strategies, and some of those are better than others. The leader of the pack is the ACT, but New South Wales overall is doing, I think, pretty well. I'm not so sure about other states. At the federal level, obviously there's been a process involved that's led to the discussion paper that was released earlier this year. I know, and I want to elaborate on this more to cover my absence of knowledge, but there's a process that the Electric Vehicle Council's involved with. Various tasks are being undertaken by bodies like ARENA. So ARENA is, as I mentioned earlier on, looking at the charging black spots around the country and so on. So there are elements. Maybe there is a case for better coordination across the federal government, and maybe, always a bit fraught with danger, but maybe involving the states and territories as well. And it is a bit fraught. I mean, I personally think that some of those states looking at charging EVs at the moment are making a preemptive grab of a revenue source that's normally flowed to the Commonwealth through the fuel excise. So they're trying to establish a system now to effectively crowd out the federal government at some future point. It's not unprecedented tactics on behalf of state and territory governments, but very disappointing in this instance.
Well, Luke, you had lots of experience in dealing with state governments. What has your experience been? What would you say if you had to ask for anything from a policy perspective as a manufacturer? What would be the priorities?
I think there's quite a few different answers to that question, but the main thing that I've come across is effectively, and putting this bluntly, is in some ways to sort of step out of the way and enable creative businesses and companies to actually roll out new innovative products without having to go through the level of scrutiny and challenges that we faced collectively in the earlier stages. So as an example, when we were first deploying electric buses in Australia, we could point to hundreds of thousands of vehicles around the world where they were operating successfully, and yet there was about 8 various different parliamentary reviews of electric buses before they would be tested in the country or states particularly. So I don't mean this offensively in any way, but in many ways, just let the market bring the best products to the government and consumers, and to use a bit of a phrase, cut the green tape, and let the market bring the products to the consumers and government.
Thank you. I'd just like to welcome Dr. Katie Allen. I think you manage now. You had trouble connecting before, so welcome to the webinar. You're on mute at the moment. Let me ask you to unmute.
Hi, good evening. So sorry, I've had some connectivity issues. My apologies.
That's perfectly fine. So we covered a little bit of policy, comparisons with other countries, what people would like from a manufacturing point of view, and Behyad from an industry point of view. What are your thoughts, Katie? How do we actually make this process a little bit faster and catch up with other countries in terms of electrification of transport in Australia?
Thank you. Look, that's a fantastic question, and obviously there's a lot of panelists. I know Trent has probably already spoken about this, but I suppose from my point of view, it's not just about electrification, by the way, it's about the whole, emissions reduction across the whole economy. So other things such as agriculture, fugitive emissions, transportation, and also looking, broadly at things like carbon soil. Just to sort of put that in conversation, you might have already covered that. But obviously, electricity sector, or energy sector, I should say, which is 30% or 33% of emissions, is an incredibly important hot topic at the moment, and electric vehicles are front and centre for that. I suppose in my view, Australia hasn't really got a choice on this, because we don't manufacture our own cars, so we're going to move to electric vehicles whether we like to or not. It's going to be, absolute definite transition, and we need to be ready for that. The tricky sort of aspect is who pays for the sort of infrastructure, or how is the infrastructure rolled out and paid for. And it would be fair to say that Europe has a very different, set of issues facing it from an infrastructure point of view, because they don't have the broad sort of continental aspect that we have. It's a smaller continent than Australia. And so how do we equitably roll out an infrastructure? And I'm also interested to know what, whether there's going to be a change to the infrastructure and things like charging units, and what technology is coming on board with regards to that, because it's all very well to plan for the future, but if we're still in a transition with regards to electric vehicle, re-energising stations, then if we invest too heavily too early, then that might be an issue. If suddenly there's a change to the technology. So we have to be nimble and flexible, but there's no doubt in my mind that we need to start moving there sooner rather than later, and particularly in urban cities, obviously. But the question is then, how do you provide the infrastructure for the whole of Australia?
Would you like to comment, Behyad?
Yeah, I'm happy to get into particularly that point around sort of future-proofing against the right or the wrong technology. So particularly for the charging infrastructure, the two things that we're seeing development in is the speed of the charging infrastructure, so how much electricity it can deploy into the vehicle, and the other, particularly on the slower end of charging, so not those very fast ones, the ability to charge wirelessly, so no longer requiring a plug, but being able to drive up to a pad and having it charged. That one particularly, I guess, is predictions about when that comes have been sort of wrong a few times, so I won't crystal ball gaze too much. The good news there is, I guess, everyone developing that technology, they're usually the same players who are doing the technology today. And if they're not, everyone is quite aware of exactly the problem that you've been outlining and not wanting to get in the way of the existing market with the promise of new technology coming. So they're making one another, they're being sort of interoperable or adaptable. So that 95% of the infrastructure that you need will look the same. It'll be a matter of just replacing the box at the very end and replacing it with a wireless pad, or replacing some of the electronics with faster electronics, or a higher capacity coming from the electricity network to the charger itself when it comes to things like speed. So it's certainly something that's well considered, because these guys they don't want to cannibalize their own sales today in order to while working on a future product. The only one outside of those things that's, I guess, much further away and is quite speculative today, but potentially exciting for the future, is what we call dynamic wireless charging. So the ability of vehicles to be able to charge while they're driving, and something that I would say put in the sort of similar types of time lengths as fully driverless vehicles, the convenience for those really being seen to match of a car not needing to stop, essentially being able to charge as it drives along, rather than needing to go and plug somewhere and having a human being have to plug it in or to interact with it.
Can I ask a question following on from that? And I presume Trent may have already outlined this, because Trent organised a visit when we went to see Arena in Canberra to look at the issue. Sorry, I've got to press the wrong button. To look at the issue of bi-directional charging, and to make our fleet of cars eventually into a mobile virtual power plant, I suppose, so that we can, all of us can be little green capitalists, which is something I think would be a great thing for Australia if we could get to that point. And I know there's a lot of technology still to go, but there's a large amount of fleets and large amount of opportunity for us. Would you like to comment on that, perhaps?
I'm happy to. Again, I don't know if you're referencing for Trent too, but so yes, this is the other piece of new technology coming, able to sort of go inside of everyone's homes. At the moment, there's only one production vehicle, the Nissan Leaf, that has this capability, but Hyundai's just announced their next generation of car coming either late this year or next year to Australia. They'll have the same capacity. So this is really this is a part of the promise of electric vehicles. We're no longer just talking about cars that happen to run on electricity, but one that is actually an electricity product or an energy product and a transport or a vehicle product as well. So being able to charge your vehicle when electricity is very cheap, or even if not free, if you have things like rooftop solar panels, and then discharge when electricity is very expensive. So you could either be making money by selling electricity back into the grid, or you could be saving money by not buying electricity from the electricity system when it is very expensive to do so. So yeah, some really great benefits there. Some of the work happening in the ACT is looking at some of those other services that get provided into our electricity system, like frequency control. So a very low amount of energy coming out of your battery, but providing something very valuable to the electricity system that usually a retailer or someone else would need to go to a generator for. If they can buy that from you instead, you're suddenly making quite a lot of money for selling, an unnoticeable amount of electricity back to them. As we said, there's some of this work occurring both around the world. It is an area, much like when it comes to some great research and sort of industry leadership, we are partly leading the world. We're one of the very few sites doing this research of showing potentially these type of products can give an electric vehicle owner something like $1,100, $1,500 back every year just by providing. And I think really importantly, we're not talking about completely depleting your battery and no longer being able to use it as a car. It's being able to trade that final 10% or that final 20% of your energy back and forth. And importantly, making that automated. So you as the customer don't have to sit there plugging things in and out, but how can we develop the AI and the software that does all of that for you, knowing that in the morning you're going to need a certain amount of charge to get you to wherever you're going.
My other point to add, and I'm sorry if this has already been covered, is my understanding is for large haul or long haul, batteries for electric vehicles are difficult, and that hydrogen is being rapidly developed, particularly for trucks. And
I think Katie's gone.
Christina, I might sort of complete that question.
Yes.
I'm not sure the same way that Katie would have, but it is a point that I made earlier, and I'm just interested in Behat or Luke's view on this. I mean, I sort of boldly stated that most of the commentary seems to indicate that hydrogen will be better suited for larger vehicles and electric for passenger vehicles. So I state that sort of with a caveat that we just don't know where technology is going to take us in relation to hydrogen. But how do we ensure that we don't spend a mozza building an EV infrastructure and then find in 15 years' time that, in fact, hydrogen cars are the better technological solution?
I think if I can answer that one, Trent, the question is very good, and it's something that comes up on a regular basis. What I can talk to is what I see on a daily basis in regards to whether it's electric cars or buses or trucks. And what I'm seeing is that the larger, longer haul type activity is where hydrogen is most likely going to find its place in the longer term. The rapid take up and quality improvements, and Bayard touched on some of the charging potential that's coming out into the market soon, is really going to see the passenger vehicles and the shorter haul vehicles, I believe, from what I'm seeing, very much battery electric driven. But there is definitely space for hydrogen in the longer haul type transport. One of the major challenges that we see with hydrogen, and we have some hydrogen interests as well, so we sort of sit on the fence a little bit on this commercially, but the challenge at the moment with hydrogen is the cost of infrastructure, and we're seeing some progress down that path, but it's still a fair way to go. So I personally don't know the complete answer, but what I'm seeing with all of these technologies, and going back to the bidirectional conversation as well, the key is to not wait. There's been so much conversation about what about this technology, what about that technology. The reality is we're moving towards a cleaner transport economy, and the economy itself is its own driver. So by transitioning and having products available, whether they be battery electric or hydrogen, is the key point, and not waiting is critical. But equally, I see that as a challenge for governments. They certainly don't want to invest in the wrong infrastructure early on. But I think the pace that things have moved over the last 5 or 6 years has been quite prudent by the government. I think they've moved at the right pace. They haven't invested in the wrong areas so far. So the track record's good, and we're seeing some hydrogen trials take place in the coming months and year or so, which will test the limits of hydrogen as well. So I think it's a very good question. There is no perfect answer, but what I would suggest, seeing this and living this day in, day out, and seeing exposure to both technologies, is to not wait. The alternate is that we stick around with internal combustion engines, which are going to become a legacy product very shortly due to market trends globally. So we shouldn't wait as a country. We should move swiftly, but also do it in a prudent manner as far as infrastructure.
I might open now to the Q&A, because we've got about 23 questions on the box. A lot of them have to do, obviously, with the cost of EVs and what incentives there are, because at the end of the day, they are still fairly expensive. Bayard, correct me if I'm wrong, and there's very few models in Australia compared to other countries. And so a lot of people are asking questions in that sense. There's one here for Trent. What financing options exist for low-income households other than the ACT's interest-free loans? How do we address the fact that many people simply can't say the loan principal back? There's also questions for you on the luxury car tax. Trent?
I'm very happy to speak about both those. We have some more about what schemes are operational around the country. On the luxury car tax, for me, I mean, there is a differential between low emission vehicles and ordinary vehicles within the luxury car tax system. I think about 10 grand difference. But to me, it's a bit of a no-brainer that we should be looking at removing the luxury car tax entirely from low emission vehicles. I think that would be a good outcome. But the biggest challenge, I think, moving forward is not the upper end of the market. It's effectively the middle of the market. And the market will evolve, is evolving in one direction, which is lower, more affordable prices. Part of the key is getting enough volume so that you establish a strong second-hand car market. It is, and that's part of the reason why I think the future fuel strategy has a bit of a focus on the commercial sector, because the turnover of cars is a lot quicker in commercial fleets, so they will enter the second-hand market more quickly. I personally do think that governments, including the federal government should look at what additional incentives might need to be provided, and I probably differ a little bit from Luke's comments in this regard, but I do see a parallel with the household solar market, where effectively governments played an important role, and the federal government played an important role, particularly through the renewable energy target, and effectively providing a financial incentive to get the market going. And over time, because of technology improving and costs coming down, that government incentive hasn't been so important. And the solar panel market, I think, is a good example, because it shows to me that Australians are ready adopters of new technology, and particularly low emissions technology, if the price is right. And if government can help make the price right in the early stages until normal market forces take over, then I don't think that's a bad thing.
For example, here I've got Tony Zeltzer asking Trent, how can governments get involved in part funding facilities of recharges at smart poles to accelerate the uptake of EVs?
Well, that partnership is happening to some degree at the moment through bodies like the CEFC and ARENA. I personally don't know enough about the economics of charging stations to know how much government assistance is required. I suspect that there'll be most obviously places where, for example, in regional Australia, where there are effectively market gaps because the economics don't stack up, but it's still going to be important to overcoming that range barrier that I talked about before. So at the very least, there's a role for government in filling the black spots where the market isn't prepared to invest. And I think, again, it's sort of catalyst funding at this stage to demonstrate the technology can work, to get that critical mass happening. And I suspect it's a bit, the other parallel, I talked about solar panels, but it's maybe, this might be completely wrong, but I sort of, my instinct is it's a bit like mobile phones. I mean, governments provide black spot funding for mobile phone towers where there's a gap, but most of the mobile phone companies are very happy to clutter every telegraph pole with their facilities, because at the end of the day, it's crucial to their commercial interests in being able to sell their product. But BHAD might have some different or better views on that.
Yeah, no, just complementary to that, Trent. I think from dealing with people providing charging infrastructure, whether it's those very fast ones that get you long distances, or doing smaller things like plugs inside of light posts and the like, what a charging infrastructure provider needs more than anything else, customers. So they want to see people driving electric vehicles so that they can sell them electricity. And looking ahead, it is will the customers come in the next 2 or 3 years? We're happy to pre-build with that certainty that this will help stimulate the market and people will then buy electric vehicles. But again, it comes back to that question of certainty of, they do have it in markets like the UK, EU and US and others who are stimulating that demand in this early period. So they know, why we see companies like Shell, BP and others investing billions of dollars in rolling out charging infrastructure, not just in the sort of lower millions as we're doing here, because they're knowing that there are plenty of customers today, but in the next few years, that is going to rise exponentially and ultimately become the entire fleet of vehicles. The question for the investor or the provider here in Australia is, will we follow that path in the next 2 years, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? That uncertainty sort of ends up holding them back from doing more, from providing more charges.
Yeah, I have a question for Luke on cost again. How do we address the high cost of an e-bus at the community level?
Of an electric bus? So I think electric buses are quite unique in the fact that they do a lot of kilometres every day. So the economics of an electric bus already stack up. Your payback comparable to a diesel Euro 5 or Euro 6, and the price difference between what that vehicle will cost and a high quality electric bus will cost, the payback period is roughly 3 years. So an electric bus is going to save you roughly $50,000 per annum because of the amount of kilometres that electric buses do on government routes. So the economics on a public transport side for electric buses, that's already been proven. That argument's been tested by many state governments, and we're already at an acceptable level. Obviously, we would like the price of electric buses to come down even further, and that will occur over the years as battery technology changes as we find ways to make the buses lighter, therefore we need less batteries to achieve the same range. But right now, putting complete environmental views aside, the best economic choice is to buy an electric bus rather than a diesel bus, because the cost savings across the life cycle of the entire bus will be about $1.1 million over the 20 years of that bus's life. So it's already economical to buy electric buses.
A bit like solar panels then.
Exactly. So the more solar panels you have on your roof, the better the payback. In the case of electric buses and public transport, because you're doing a lot of kilometres, the payback is very quick. If you had a bus that sat there all day and didn't do many kilometres, it'd be a different story. But with every bus working quite hard, the payback is quick.
I think an important point when we're talking about sort of what governments can do on government leadership, and there's really what the New South Wales Transport Minister Andrew Constance has done, which is one of the sort of greatest bits of political leadership in the EV sector that has occurred, is set a target for transitioning all of the buses in the New South Wales bus fleet to electric by 2030. We've now seen other markets like the ACT say we'll instate similar targets because we can piggyback off the good work that you're doing. But what we saw very realistically inside the market was a whole range of operators, manufacturers, people involved in the bus sector who were uncertain, had a lot of work to do to find out how to transition to electric. It was a new technology. We saw all of that uncertainty, all the obstacles disappear because the direction was set from the top, on the minister, the decision maker, saying this is the direction we are heading in. Either much as is happening in cities around the EU and across Asia, either come and compete for that opportunity or you miss out. And what do you know? There's no more obstacles left, and of course electric buses are actually cheaper to run. And then we also get the added benefit of the type of work that Luke and some of his competitors, who I won't name here today, are doing, of actually building the buses in New South Wales as well. That is, it's the other benefit of acting early, rather than somebody else getting those jobs and somebody else getting those investment. You get them at home.
And I'll echo that. I think Minister Constance's announcement was probably one of the strongest pieces of leadership that we've seen in the transport industry, and that was a credit to him and his team to come out and make a bold announcement, because what that did was sent a whole sort of indication through the whole industry of who supplies vehicles as to where the government wants to head. And that was as simple as a committed announcement to where the government wants to lead. It didn't require a huge financial investment to roll out or contribute to assisting industry at all. It was just a committed decision that has now led to a strong acceptance from the market and reaction.
Few more questions. People are asking here how we can get enough green supply to the grid to support electrification of transport. Beya, do you have an answer to that?
By green supply, do you mean for renewable electricity?
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah, no, so I think in some ways this is a trend that's already underway. I think it probably fits into broader electricity policy of helping accelerate that as well. So maybe another one to throw to Trent. I'm not sure if you want to take that one on as well. But I guess the good news in one sense is that the market is heading in that direction in terms of renewable electricity. I think AEMO's forecasts have us at around over 50% of our electricity coming from renewable energy by 2030. There's the concerning thing of, while we're decarbonising our electricity source, we're increasing emissions from our transport sector, when the answer for one lies in the other. You're making more clean energy, use more of it. But I think as well, much like with rooftop solar panels and Australians' acceptance of them and high uptake of them, one of those great benefits around electric vehicles is it puts the power in the consumer's hands. Says that if you care about reducing emissions, well, buy an electric vehicle and start charging it from renewable energy right away. Pick that from your retailer or put in rooftop solar panels and you're at zero emissions. You don't have to wait for the entire system to catch up.
Trent?
Just to add to what we had said, I mean, the projections for the percentage of energy that will come from renewable sources increases, I think I'm fairly safe in saying, each year. So grows each year, which is great. And And the deployment of renewable energy, both at the household level but at scale, is phenomenal in Australia at the moment. And I look at the market forces are only heading one direction on that, and that is for more renewables. Now, the challenge, I think, with the electrification of transport, it is for all sectors, is obviously making sure that the networks cope with that. I think there's probably been a little bit undue concern about the impact of electric vehicles in the short and medium term on networks, and all the predictions are that the network could cope quite well. I mean, maybe more work needs to be done about peak times, but because obviously if everyone chose to renew their vehicles at exactly the same hour of the day, then that would put a strain on the system. But organisations like AEMO and so on are actually doing the planning now to accommodate the growth in electric vehicles that it's expected, and I'm confident that the network can cope with even greater growth than is currently predicted. But obviously, you maximise the benefits of electric vehicles when you maximise the amount of power that's coming from renewable sources. It's a no-brainer that that's the case, as it is across any sector you electrify. So I think it adds further impetus to the march towards 100% clean energy.
Someone's asking here if any of you are prepared to talk about trains and trains with e-bikes, the biggest solution. Luke,
I'm happy to say that. I recently tried an skateboard, which was a bit of a disaster. But I certainly agree with those that are saying that e-scooters and bikes need to be legalised across Australia. I think it's only in the ACT and maybe Queensland where that's currently the case. The National Transport Commission, I think it is looking at the issue in the middle of the year, and hopefully they'll provide some national guidance, but it'll still be up to individual states to implement that. I think the question was in relation to trains. There's still in some urban networks electrification that needs to occur. So, for example, I think in Adelaide they haven't electrified their metropolitan train network, but I can't really comment about long-haul trains as to where that's at.
Anyone else, or?
Just to say that electric bikes and scooters and not motorcycles and skateboards are a lot of fun. So yeah, the sooner that get them all legalized, the better. And for things like skateboards to be able to relive my youth, albeit now much less fit than I used to be, an electric one would be a lot more handy for me than having to kick it.
I have to tell you, an electric skateboard wasn't much fun for my dignity.
At least you tried, Trent. There's Marcus Martinez. I just thought this was interesting. It's more for comments. It's not a question, but some perspectives looking at infrastructure. The world's biggest battery in South Australia, which costs 80 to 100 million, only contains enough energy to refuel 1,000 Tesla Model S cars. The equivalent amount of energy in petrol can be carried in a B-double tanker. This highlights that the problem is going to be in generating and storing sufficient alternative energy. How do we solve this issue, Behyad?
Yeah, in terms of how do we generate enough electricity and then transport it to people's homes, that isn't the challenge for us. I think it can be difficult sometimes to look at things like the Tesla big battery out of South Australia and talk about how much electricity it's able to store and feed back into the system. We often hear people talk about, that would only provide enough electricity for South Australia for such a short period of time. Those type of products are actually meant to provide other energy services to the grid. So just electricity consumption isn't the only thing the electricity system's doing. There are a whole bunch of frequency control leveling services that are required. And that's in fact, those type of services and the decentralization of them through batteries in people's cars is why we say not only can the grid accept more electric vehicles, but done well, and the type of work that groups like the Australian Energy Market Operator and others are doing are showing that it can actually improve the resilience and the stability of the electricity system. And it can, in fact, bring down the unit price for electricity. So it can make electricity cheaper to have as well. Again, that is the question around, can we generate enough clean energy? Yes, we absolutely can. It's just knowing in advance, the planning requirements are different if we're going to have 1 million electric vehicles or 3 million electric vehicles in the next 10 years. So as I say, that stuff comes back to certainty of what path are we taking, how many will there be, so that we can start planning accordingly.
Thank you. I think we've only got time for one or two more. The EU has seen great success forcing a charging standard to be adopted by all manufacturers to avoid fragmenting the charging infrastructure. How is Australia going to tackle the problem of charging interoperability? I think that's quite an important issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it's something I'm happy to say that industry has resolved in the absence of a mandatory standard. So the very first generation of electric vehicles that came out had their home countries plug types. Recognizing that that's not useful for consumers, the industry got together and decided on a standard type of plug for both AC and DC charging today.
Is there a standard for buses, for public transport, Luke?
Sorry, I had a connectivity issue then. Could you repeat the question?
In terms of charging standards, is there one for public transport, for the buses?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. What we're seeing is a very standardized approach from manufacturers. So we've not seen any issue in the public transport side. What we have, as far as the plug type, what we have seen is a challenge in regards to in buses, whether it's a DC or AC charging unit that's required for the vehicles. Fortunately, once again, the market is solving that problem. Our company, as an example, now has a bus that accepts both AC and DC on the same bus. So when you're rolling out a bus depot, you don't need to install all DC chargers or AC chargers. You can have a combination of both, so you get the best of both worlds. So fortunately, industry once again is solving that issue as we move along.
Thank you, and I'll finish with one question for Trent and Katie. She's not going to be back, I don't think. I think she's had lots of connectivity issues, but for you then, Trent, somebody's suggesting, will you champion a national EV task force with industry, state and federal parliamentarians to develop the plan for rapid EV take-up?
Well, certainly at the federal level, I'm very happy to do that, and always reticent about what the states and territories might do. But you do need. But it is an important point, because you do need coordination. A lot of road transport does fall within the responsibilities of the state, and obviously they have the capacity to both provide incentives through their registration and tolling systems, and even stamp duty. And on the flip side of the coin, as we've seen from Victoria, they also have the capacity to interrupt what we'd hope would be a natural progression for EVs. So that level of coordination will be very important.
Thank you, Trent. I think that's all the time we have this evening. It's fair to say that, and especially Behiad would know, since our last event, there has been some positive movement, especially at state level. So we're all pleased to see that there's it might be slow, but we're getting there. So on behalf of C4C, to all of you panelists, thanks for joining us tonight and sharing your insights. This is a conversation that we could be here another hour. Unfortunately, we don't have time. We will have to do another session very soon. And of course, thanks also to our audience for participating and contributing to this very important conversation on electrification of transport. So I hope it's enlightened you a little bit more. And I also hope that you can join us next week on Wednesday at our next webinar. It will be on waste management and marine health with Trevor Evans and Warren Edge. So good night, everyone, and hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye.